Um, Hello, everybody, again. Um, so my name is Juan Jose. Some people call me Mago, and I'm gonna talk about more valuable unit specs. Yeah, and um, well, to start this presentation, um, let's talk about what an spec is. So, what is an specification? That's something very important because we sometimes write these things, but we lose focus on what is in a specification. Uh, so, what is in a specification? I don't know. My people say I don't know. Uh, Unit spec, the expected value or the definition of a behavior. Um, So in reality, an specification is a set of requirements that a product or service uh, should meet. And when we are writing uh, unit specs, we should keep that in mind. Those are requirements. So when we're writing, um, it's very important to keep in mind how are we going to name it and how it should read. Because you expect that only reads like um, it should update this field. That is not a requirement. Doesn't read like a requirement. Doesn't read like something your client would tell you. And so um, let's continue. So how to write a specification, a correct specification? Uh, Avoid the expected value, the word expected. That's a little cancer on some uh, tests. And that is because tests should be clear, they should be explicit. And so when you're doing like, um, you're testing a function that calculates something. And then in your test, you say it should return the expected value. So in that case, you're actually not saying anything because that is not a requirement. Of course, the test should return something that the client expects, but if you don't write it explicitly, then that thing can return anything, and it's gonna uh, read right. So in this kind of specs, when is it gonna fail? One might think, and it's gonna fail when the context is wrong or when the client wants the unexpected value and they don't want the unexpected value. And so we should avoid this word in our unit specs, mostly because if you want to know if that's okay, you need to read the context. And the context is not a trustful source of truth because you can be wrong and also hard to read. Um, and so we also avoid long context. Um, that is because if it's too hard to write, it's hard to read, and it's very long, then you have a you have to, how do you say that? Um, Actually, mm, maintain this, and these are very hard to maintain. Some things even more hard than maintain the actual code, and that is not good because these sets, these specifications are there to help us, not to drag us down. Um, there, they should be uh, humanly readable. I don't know if that's, yeah, uh, they should be easy to read by humans. So um, sometimes it's even more important that the specification actually tells you the truth. That you can read it and you say, okay, this is what this should do, rather than the actual specs works. Because if it tells you uh, this is what this object, this method do, uh, then you can write it without any problem. You can change it without any problem. But if you don't know what is what is this, then you cannot change it. So those are the kind of specifications that I would rather just delete. Uh, it should be explicit. Avoid space for misunderstandings. Um, so that's another point. I think I've been repeating this a lot, and our specification should be explicit. So uh, no ambiguous things should be written. Gonna continue. How to identify flawed specifications. Um, so this is when you have to stop and think about what you're doing. Because yes, we all want to have the 1% coverage on our code, but sometimes we shouldn't force it. Uh, so these are some um, scenarios when you have to just take a moment, look what you're doing, and rethink it. So it's too hard to test. When something is too hard to test, then you know there's something wrong there. Um, and this might be two reasons. Either the code is not uh, it's not well it's not modular. So when things are not modular, you have to write long context. It's hard to test. You have to mock a lot of stuff, and there's when you have to stop and say, okay, this is not going to work. I have to refactor and uh, write another test about it. But do not force the test. Just like, okay, it's not working, but it should work, and I'm gonna do it work because I have to have the 100% coverage. Um, it doesn't read like something a human would say. Um, that this again has to do with the naming of our specifications. Because as I said, saying like it should update the field that is not in the specification doesn't read like a requirement. Your client will never tell you, yeah, do that and should update the field. So something to keep in mind there. It is too ambiguous. Then again, if you're not sure what this should do, then you might as well uh, write it again or delete it until you have the correct requirement. And it's a lie. We sometimes came across this, and I know that some people might think that deleting the test is actually losing quality. And that is not true, because sometimes some things just do not apply anymore. So when that happens, you have to delete your test, because those are lies. And you cannot keep them there. And so you have to you have to be not afraid of actually deleting tests that are not helping anymore. The specification code depends too much on the implementation. So this is those scenarios where you have your unit test, and every time you change something on your production code, you have to get back to your test and refactor it, even though the output is the same. So those are very nasty tests, very bad, because those encourage you to just not write any more tests. So avoid having a lot of mocks to do this, because if your context depends, well, if your implementation depends too much on the actual context, then you're gonna have to do this over and over again, just to change production code, get back to the test, even though it's the same, it's working the same. Yeah. I renamed this. So why the project structure is important? So I think I have an old version of my presentation, and but by this I meant the actual structure of how you name your things and where you store them on the project, the files, because when you're looking for something for how this works, something like that, there is where the specifications comes in handy, because these should be treated as documentation, and so you have to know where to search for them. If not, then those are like a book with all the pages around, so you need to structure everything so that you can read the chapter 2, chapter 3, things like that. So some things to keep in mind. Prioritize specification of your entities over any other architectural pattern. By architectural pattern, I actually mean the CQRS. I'm kind of inclined to always prioritize tests on your domain, on your entities, because the CQRS is a layer above it. So you have to describe your domain, not the architectural pattern that is above it. One important thing about this is that when we do these kind of things, actually testing the handler, then testing, well, just testing the handler, the logic sometimes gets diluted, and handlers end up with a lot of logic that shouldn't be there, should be on the actual entities like behavior. And so that's what I would recommend, to prioritize specifications on the entities. What does this entity do? Treat the specification as your documentation. So at the end, you want to have your test or your specs to be your documentation. You want to be able to get back to them and read them and know what is the actual state of the project, so that you can say like, okay, what does this do? And without having to read all the code, you can just read the specifications. You should be able to uh, just read the names, read the assertions, and that should be all. And um, this documentation should be useful to your clients and developers. So it should be clear enough so that you can just print it and give it to your client. So this is what your system do. If there's something wrong there, then you can tell us. So that's why it's very important to avoid this kind of word like expected and should be like, because those really doesn't communicate anything. As I said, the client will always expect that everything is fine. So I want the expected value. So that's just saying nothing. It's just writing words. And sometimes those might look like valid specs, but at the end they're just lazy, I would say. They're there, but they don't really communicate. Define pattern for specifications, how to name them, where to place them, and what needs to be specified. So this has to do also with the what I said before of where to put your specs, so that they can be easily searched. If you want to know what the user can do, then it should be easily searchable. So what I would recommend is when you have your project structure, create a folder for each entity and then describe the behavior there. So the user has a function that, I don't know, says reset password, yeah, maybe. And inside that folder, that is also the name of the function of that entity, you have the specifications, the requirements, what should happen when the user changes his password. And so if I'm gonna make a change there, I can easily say, okay, this is on the user entity. The name of the method is change password. So I'm just gonna go and see what it should do. So never throw your specs just to the domain spec project, because they end up having one level and a lot of files, 50, 200 files that just start when, and it's impossible to search that. And it's even harder to just do not know who named those specifications, because you might have your own pattern when naming things, and you might think like, I think I name it like this, but the thing is that you're not gonna work all the time in that project, and somebody else might get in, and your specification should be there to help that other guy, not just you, and should be easy for them to read all what you have done. And I think that's it for my talk today. And yeah, so anybody has a question?
Can you give an example of prioritizing the entity over the architecture?
Sure.
Code example?
So I'm gonna show you uh, 3 examples of what I mean when saying that tests should be explicit, that you should avoid the word expected, and always prioritize the tests on your entities. So this spec that has the expected word on it. And this always follows a pattern, and that is that the context is very long and is where the actual true is. Um, so I'm gonna scroll it. As you can see, it's a very long test. So when adding build out well to build out wells, um, actually it sounds I know it sounds hard to understand if you don't have the context. Um, but even if you have the context, it sounds very weird. So that's another thing about uh, name them so that a human can read. It should read like something you would say, your client would say. And so we have our context, which is very long. And we also have the expected object and the assertion. It should return the expected wells. So the thing about this is that if you want to know if this is wrong, if the test actually telling you the truth, you have to read your long context. You have to understand it, and you actually have to know what is this expected value, and this might be wrong. So it's very hard to just get into it and know like, oh, okay, this is not doing what it should do, unless you have a lot of knowledge of what the system do. An example of test on your entities. So one thing that you might notice is that immediately get a little insight of what is the behavior. You don't need to read the context, and you shouldn't read the context unless you're making changes. So try to do that. All you can help your developers, your fellow developers, even your clients, because you can it's actually smaller because we are inheriting from the one that is above. Um, so that way we are making the context smaller, because sometimes things just get repeated over and over again. And you want to test the one scenario that is almost like this one, but with a little change. So in those cases, you just nest it like you would do on Jasmine and this kind of PDD um, frameworks. Um, so yeah. Yeah, that's only for when you're running your specs. Um, you get that extra information of what are you testing. Yeah. So it's a little hint just to help you and so that you don't read the when. That is hard to read. I think I have another example. And another thing about the command handlers is that in reality, they shouldn't do much. So if your command handler is actually executing a lot of methods from your entities, then you shouldn't. Well, I think you should, but always prioritize the modular things so that you can have your test slim and consist and direct. You don't want to have a very general tests because it gets ambiguous, and that's bad. This is an example of explicit kind of test. So we have our name. When calculating a pilot model with 1.5 wells per month for 2 months. So the name is long, and I don't know if you actually get what we're saying here, but with the context, when you have the context, it reads like something the client would tell you. What are Yeah. So this could even be something you would write on your cards, on your Trello cards. Like, okay, we have this scenario, and we expect to have this and this. So if we go to the assertions, let's say it should create 3 wells, 1.5 wells per month for 2 months. It should create the tree. It should create the first well on the second month. It should create the second well on the third month. It should create the third well on the third month also. So we have we have this scenario here, and is that we're creating 3 wells, but in 2 months, but we only can create them at the start or the end of a month. So we're gonna say like, we're gonna have one at the middle. So what happens here is that only the first one is created on the second month, and the other 2 are created at the end. And I remember when we were working on this, and that's a question we had, like, can we actually do this, or how we should do this? And we needed to ask. So we asked Nathaniel. Nathaniel asked the client, and so forth. And we actually came here, and I decided to write it as an actual requirement, not just a test of what the expected value is, but the actual requirement. And this is something that might help another person in the future, so that he doesn't need to ask Nathaniel, and Nathaniel doesn't need to ask back to the client, and he can come here and just read what you should do, what is the behavior of this. And so this is an example of how explicit should be your tests, and not just a true false thing with that doesn't tell you anything. So that's my example. Anybody has any other question?
Want to refactor something with Saul? You got 20 minutes left. Spec you want to refactor?
No, I don't think so. Yep.
Any other comments?
Okay.